Gather round, boys and girls. You're listening to Astounding Stories of Super Science. Out of the past comes the radio program that might have been but never was, about the worlds that may yet still come to be, bringing to light the thrilling adventure stories of yesterday for the children of tomorrow. Tonight's episode, the thrilling conclusion to The Beetle Horde by Victor Rousseau. Can Tommy Travers save the world from being consumed by giant insects? Will Jimmy Dodd marry the gigantic cave woman of his dreams? Don't miss a second of tonight's thrilling episode. Read for you by #1 Marmaduke fan, America's most mysterious bespectacled cartoon dog. And now, our feature presentation.
Bullets, shrapnel, shell, nothing can stop the trillions of famished, man-sized beetles which, led by a madman, sweep down over the human race. The Beetle Horde by Victor Rousseau. Conclusion. Tommy Travers and James Dodd of the Travers Antarctic Expedition crash in their planes somewhere near the South Pole and are seized by a swarm of man-sized beetles. They are carried down to Submundia, a world under the Earth's crust, where the beetles have developed their civilization to an amazing point, using a wretched race of degenerated humans whom they breed as cattle for food. The insect horde is ruled by a human from the outside world, a drug-doped madman. Dodd recognizes this man as Brahm, the archaeologist who had been lost for years before at the pole and given up for dead by a world he hated because it refused to accept his radical scientific theories. His fiendish mind now plans the horrible revenge of leading his unconquerable horde of monster insects forth to ravage the world, destroy the human race, and establish a new era, the era of the insect. The world has to be warned of the impending doom. The two, with Hydia, a girl of Submundia, escape and pass through menacing dangers to within 2 miles of the exit. There, suddenly, Tommy sees towering over him a creature that turns his blood cold, a gigantic praying mantis. Before he has time to act, the monster springs at them. Chapter 7. Through the Inferno. Fortunately, the monster miscalculated its leap. The huge legs, whirling through the air, came within a few inches of Tommy's head, but passed over him, and the mantis plunged into the stream. Instantly, the water was alive with leaping things, with faces of such grotesque horror that Tommy sat paralyzed in his rocking shell, unable to avert his eyes. Things no more than a foot or two in length, to judge from the slender, eel-like bodies that leaped into the air. But things with catfish heads and tentacles and eyes waving on stalks. Things with claw-like appendages to their vertical fins and mouths that widened to fearful size, so that the whole head seemed to disappear above them, disclosing fangs like wolves. Instantly the water was churned into phosphorescent fire as they precipitated themselves upon the struggling mantis, whose enormous form, extending halfway from shore to shore, was covered with the river monsters, gnawing, rending, tearing. Luckily, the struggles of the dying monster carried it downstream instead of up. In a few moments, the immediate danger was past, and suddenly Hydia awoke, sat up. "Where are we?" she cried. "Oh, I can see! I can see! Something has burned away from my eyes. I know this place. A wise man of my people once came here, and returned to tell of it. We must go on. Soon we shall be safe on the wide river, but there is another way that leads to here. We must go on! We must go on!" Even as she spoke, they heard the distant rasping of the beetle legs, and before the shells were well in mid-current, they saw the beetle horde coming round the bend. In the front of them, Brahm, reclining on his shell couch and drawn by the 8 trained beetles. Brahm saw the fugitives, and a roar of ironic mirth broke from his lips, resounding high above the strident rasping of the beetle legs, and roaring over the marshes. "I've got you, Dodd and Travers," he bellowed, as the trained beetles hovered above the shell canoes. "You thought you were clever, but you're at my mercy. Now's your last chance, Dodd. I'll save you still if you submit to me, if you'll admit that there were fossil monotremes before the Pleistocene epoch. Come, it's so simple. Say it after me. The marsupial lion—" "You go to hell!" yelled Dodd, nearly upsetting his shell as he shook his fist at his enemy. High above the rasping sound came Brahm's shrill whistle. Just audible to human ears, though probably sounding like the roar of thunder to those of the beetles, there was no need to wonder what it was. It was the call to slaughter. Like a black cloud, the beetles shot forward. A serried phalanx covered the two men and the girl, hovering a few feet overhead, the long legs dangling to within arm's reach, and a terrible cry of fear broke from Hydia's lips. Suddenly, Tommy remembered Brahm's cigarette lighter. He pulled it from his pocket and ignited it. Small as the flame was, it was actinically much more powerful than the brighter phosphorescence of the fungi behind them. The beetle cloud overhead parted. The strident sound was broken into a confused buzzing as the terrified, blinded beetles plopped into the stream. None of them, fortunately, fell into either of the three shells, but the mass of struggling monsters in the water was hardly less formidable to the safety of the occupants than that menacing cloud overhead. "Get clear!" Tommy yelled to Dodd, trying to help the shell along with his hands. He heard Brahm's cry of baffled rage and, looking backward, could not refrain from a laugh of triumph. Brahm's trained steeds had taken fright and overset him. Brahm had fallen into the red mud beside the stream, from which he was struggling up, plastered from head to feet, and shaking his fists and evidently cursing, though his words could not be heard. "How about your marsupial lion now, Brahm?" yelled Dodd. "No monotremes before the Pleistocene. Do you get that? That's my slogan now and forevermore." Brahm shrieked and raved and seemed to be inciting the beetles to a renewed assault. The air was still thick with them, but Tommy was waving the cigarette lighter in a flaming arc, which cleared the way for them. Then suddenly came disaster. The flame went out. Tommy closed the lighter with a snap and opened it. In vain. In his excitement, he must have spilled all the contents, for it would not catch. Brahm saw and yelled derision. The beetle cloud was thickening. Tommy, now abreast of his companions on the widening stream, saw the imminent end. And then, once more, fate intervened. For, leaping through the air out of the places where they had lain concealed, 6 mantises launched themselves at their beetle prey. Those awful bounds of the long-legged monsters, the scourges of the insect world, carried them clear from one bank to the other, fortunately for the occupants of the shells. In an instant, the beetle cloud dissolved, and it had all happened in a few seconds. Before Dodd or Tommy had quite taken in the situation, the mantises, each carrying a victim in its grooved legs, had vanished like the beetles. There was no sign of Brahm. The 3 were alone upon the face of the stream, which went swirling upward into renewed darkness. Tommy saw Dodd bend toward Hydia as she lay on her shell couch. He heard the sound of a noisy kiss, and he lay back in the hollow of his shell with the feeling that nothing that could happen in the future could be worse than what they had passed through. Days went by. Days when the sense of dawning freedom filled their hearts with hope. Hydia told Dodd and Tommy that, according to the legends of her people, the river ran into the world from which they had been driven by the flood ages before. There had been no further signs of Brahm or the Beetle Horde, and Dodd and Tommy surmised that it had been disorganized by the attack of the mantises, and that Brahm was engaged in regaining his control over it. But neither of them believed that the respite would be a long one, and for that reason they rested ashore only for the briefest intervals, just long enough to snatch a little sleep, and to eat some of the shrimps that Hydia was adept at finding, or to pull some juicy fruit surreptitiously from a tree. Incidents there were, nevertheless, during those days. For hours, their shells were followed by a school of the luminous river monsters, which, nevertheless, made no attempt to attack them. And once, hearing a cry from Hydia as she was gathering shrimps, Dodd ran forward to see her battling furiously with a luminous scorpion, 8 feet in length, that had sprung at her from its lurking place behind a pear shrub. Dodd succeeded in stunning and dispatching the monster without suffering any injury from it, but the strain of the period was beginning to tell on all of them. Worst of all, they seemed to have left all the luminous vegetation behind them, and were entering a region of almost total darkness, in which Hydia had to be their eyes. Something had happened to the girl's sight in the journey over the petrol spring. As a matter of fact, the third, or nictitating membrane, which the humans of Submundia possessed, in common with birds, had been burned away. Hydia could see as well as ever in the dark, but she could bear more light than formerly as well. Unobtrusively, she assumed command of the party. She anticipated their wants, dug shrimps in the darkness, and fed Tommy and Dodd with her own hands. "God, what a girl!" breathed Dodd to his friend. "I've always had the reputation of being a woman-hater, Tommy, but once I get that girl to civilization, I'm going to take her to the nearest little church around the corner in record time." "I wish you luck, old man, I'm sure," answered Tommy. Dodd's words did not seem strange to him. Civilization was growing very remote to him, and Broadway seemed like a memory of some previous incarnation. The river was growing narrower again, and swifter too. On the last day or night of their journey, though they did not know that it was to be their last, it swirled so fiercely that it threatened every moment to overset their beetle shells. Suddenly, Tommy began to feel giddy. He gripped the side of the shell with his hand. "Tommy, we're going round!" shouted Dodd in front of him. There was no longer any doubt of it. The shells were revolving in a vortex of rushing, foaming water. "Hydia!" they shouted. The girl's voice came back thickly across the roaring torrent. The circles grew smaller. Tommy knew that he was being sucked nearer and nearer to the edge of some terrific whirlpool in that inky blackness. Now he could no longer hear Dodd's shouts, and the shell was tipping so that he could feel the water rushing along the edge of it. But for the exercise of centrifugal force, he would have been flung from his perilous seat, for he was leaning inward at an angle of 45 degrees. Then suddenly his progress was arrested. He felt the shell being drawn to the shore. He leaped out, and Hydia's strong hands dragged the shell out of the torrent, while Tommy sank down, gasping. "What's the matter?" he heard Dodd demanding. "There is no more river," said Hydia calmly. "It goes into a hole in the ground. So much I have heard from the wise men of my people. They say that it is near such a place that they fled from the flood in years gone by." "Then we're near safety," shouted Tommy. "That river must emerge as a stream somewhere in the upper world, Dodd. I wonder where the road lies." "There is a road here," came Hydia's voice. "Let us put on our shells again, since who knows whether they may not be beetles here." "Did you ever see such a girl as that?" demanded Dodd ecstatically. "First she saves our lives, and then she thinks of everything. Good Lord, she'll remember my meals, and to wind my watch for me, and... But Hydia's voice, some distance ahead, interrupted Dodd's soliloquy, and, hoisting the beetle shells upon their backs, they started along the rough trail that they could feel with their feet over the stony ground. It was still as dark as pitch, but soon they found themselves traveling up a sunken way that was evidently a dry watercourse, and now and again Hydia's reassuring voice would come from in front of them. The road grew steeper. There could no longer be any doubt that they were ascending toward the surface of the earth. But even the weight of the beetle shells and the steepness could not account for the feeling of intense weakness that took possession of them. Time and again they stopped, panting. "We must be very near the surface, Dodd," said Tommy. "We've surely passed the center of gravity. That's what makes it so difficult." "Come on," Hydia said in her quiet voice, stretching out her hand through the darkness. And for very shame they had to follow her. On and on, hour after hour, up the steep ascent, resting only long enough to make them realize their utter fatigue. On because Hydia was leading them, and because, in the belief that they were about to leave that awful land behind them, their desires lent new strength to their limbs continuously. Suddenly, Hydia uttered a fearful cry. Her ears had caught what became apparent to Dodd and Jimmy several seconds later. Far down in the hollow of the earth, increased by the echoes that came rumbling up, they heard the distant, strident rasp of the beetle swarm. Then it was Dodd's turn to support Hydia and whisper consolation in her ears. No thought of resting now. If they were to be overwhelmed at last by the monsters, they meant to be overwhelmed in the upper air. It was growing insufferably hot. Blasts of air, as if from a furnace, began to rush up and down past them, and the trail was growing steeper still, and slippery as glass. "What is it, Jim?" Tommy panted, as Dodd, leaving Hydia for a moment, came back to him. "I'd say lava," Dodd answered. "If only one could see something. I don't know how she finds her way. My impression is that we're coming out through the interior of an extinct volcano." "But where are there volcanoes in the South Polar regions?" inquired Tommy. "There are Mount Erebus and Mount Terror. In South Victoria Land, active volcanoes discovered by Sir James Ross in 1841, and again by Borchgrevink in 1899. If that's where we're coming out, well, Tommy, we're doomed, because it's the heart of the polar continent. We might as well turn back." "But we won't turn back," said Tommy. "I'm damned if we do." "We're damned if we don't," said Dod. "Come along, please," sang Hydia's voice high up the slope. They struggled on, and now a faint luminosity was beginning to penetrate that infernal darkness. The rasping of the beetle legs, too, was no longer audible. Perhaps they had thrown Brahm off their track. Perhaps in the darkness he had not known which way they had gone after leaving the whirlpool. That thought encouraged them to a last effort. They pushed their flagging limbs upward through an inferno of heated air. Suddenly Dod uttered a yell and pointed upward. "God!" ejaculated Tommy. Then he'd seized Dod in his arms and nearly crushed him. For high above them, a pinpoint in the black void, they saw a star. They were almost at the Earth's surface. One more effort, and suddenly the ground seemed to give beneath them. They breathed the outer air and went sliding down a chute of sand and stopped, half buried, at the bottom. Chapter 8. Recaptured. "Where are we?" each demanded of the other as they staggered out. It was a moonless night, and the air was chill. But they were certainly nowhere near the polar regions, for there was no trace of snow to be seen anywhere. All about them was sand, with here and there a spiny shrub standing up stiff and erect and solitary. When they had disengaged themselves from the climbing sand, they could see that they were apparently in the hollow of a vast crater that must have been 1/2 a mile in circumference. It was low and worn down to an elevation of not more than 200 or 300 feet, and evidently the volcano that had thrown it up had been extinct for millennia. "Water!" gasped Dod. They looked all about them. They could see no signs of a spring anywhere, and both were parched with thirst after their terrific climb. "We must find water, Hydia," said Tommy. "Why, what's the matter?" Hydia was pointing upward at the starry heaven and shivering with fear. "Eyes!" she cried. "Big beetles waiting for us up there." No, Hydia," Dot explained. "Those are stars. They are worlds, places where people live." "Will you take me up there?" asked Hydia. "No, this is our world," said Dod. "And by the sun will rise. That's a big ball of fire up there. He watches over the world and gives us light and warmth. Don't be afraid. I'll take care of you." "Hydia is not afraid with Jimmy Dod to take care of her," replied the girl with dignity. "Hydia smells water over there." She pointed across one side of the crater. "There we'd better hurry," said Tommy, "because I can't hold out much longer." The three scrambled over the soft sand, which sucked in their feet to the ankle at every step. It was with great difficulty that they succeeded in reaching the crater's summit, low though it was. Then Dod uttered a cry and pointed. In front of them extended a long pool of water, with a scrubby growth around the edges. The ground was firmer here, and they hurried toward it. Tommy was the first to reach it. He lay down on his face and drank eagerly. He had taken in a quart before he discovered that the water was saline. At the same time, Dod uttered an exclamation of disgust. Hydia, too, after sipping a little of the fluid, had stood up, chattering excitedly in her own language. But she was not chattering about the water. She was pointing toward the scrub. "Men there!" she cried. "Men like you and Tommy, Jimmy Dod." Tommy and Dod looked at each other. The water was already forgotten in their excitement at Hydia's information, which neither of them doubted. Brave as she was, the girl now hung back behind Dod, letting the two men take precedence of her. The water, saline as it was, had partly quenched their thirst. They felt their strength reviving. And it was the growing light. In the east, the sky was already flecked with yellow-pink. They felt a thrill of intense excitement at the prospect of meeting others of their kind. "Where do you think we are?" asked Tommy. Dod stopped to look at a shrub that was grown near the edge of the pool. "I don't think, I know, Tommy," he answered. "This is Wattle." "Yes?" "We're somewhere in the interior regions of the Australian continent, and that's not going to help us much." Over there, panted Hydia. "Hold me, Jimmy Dod. I can't see. This terrible light." She screwed her eyelids tightly together to shut out the pale light of dawn. The men had already discovered that the third membrane had been burned away. "We must get her out of here," whispered Dodd to Tommy. "Somewhere where it's dark before the sun rises. Let's go back to the entrance of the crater." But Hydia, her arm extended, persisted. "Over there! Over there!" Suddenly, a spear came whirling out of a growth of wattle beside the pool. It whizzed past Tommy's face and dropped into the sand behind. Between the trunks of the wattles, they could see the forms of a party of blackfellows watching them intently. Tommy held up his arms and moved forward with a show of confidence that he was far from feeling. After what he had escaped in the underworld, he was in no mood to be massacred now. But the blacks were evidently not hostile. It was probable that the spear had not been aimed to kill. At the sight of the two white men and the white woman, they came forward doubtfully, then more fearlessly, shouting in their language. In another minute, Tommy and Dodd were the center of a group of wondering savages. Especially Hydia. 3 or 4 djinns, or black women, had crept out of the scrub and were already examining her with guttural cries and fingering the hair garment that she wore. "Water," said Tommy, pointing to his throat, and then to the pool with a frown of disgust. The blackfellows grinned and led the 3 a short distance to a place where a large hollow had been scooped in the sandy floor of the desert. It was full of water, perfectly sweet to the taste. The 3 drank gratefully. Suddenly the edge of the sun appeared above the horizon, gilding the sand with gold. The sunlight fell upon the 3, and Hydia uttered a terrible cry of distress. She dropped upon the sand, her hands pressed to her eyes convulsively. Tommy and Dodd dragged her into the thickest part of the scrub, where she lay, moaning. They contrived bandages from the remnants of their clothing, and these, damped with cold water and bound over the girl's eyes, alleviated her suffering somewhat. Meanwhile, the blackfellows had prepared a meal of roast possum. After their long diet of shrimps, it tasted like ambrosia to the 2 men. Much to their surprise, Hydia seemed to enjoy it too. The 3 squatted in the scrub among the friendly blacks, discussing their situation. "These fellows will save us," said Dodd. "It may be that we're quite near the coast, but, anyway, they'll stick to us, even if only out of curiosity. They'll take us somewhere. But as soon as we get Hydia to safety, we'll have to go back along our trail. We mustn't lose our direction. Suppose I was to laughed at when I get back, called a liar. I tell you, we've got to have something to show, to prove my statements, before I can persuade anybody to fit out an expedition into Submundia. Even those 3 beetle shells that we dropped in the crater won't be conclusive evidence for the type of mind that sits in the chairs of science today. And, speaking of that, we must get those blacks to carry those shells for us. I tell you, nobody will believe." "What's that?" cried Tommy sharply, as a rasping sound rose above the cries of the frightened blacks. But there was no need to ask. Out of the crater, 2 enormous beetles were winging their way toward them. 2 beetles larger than any that they had seen. Fully 7 feet in length, they were circling about each other, apparently engaged in a vicious battle. The fearful beaks stabbed at the flesh beneath the shells, and they alternately stabbed and drew back, all the while approaching the party, which watched them, petrified with terror. It was evident that the monsters had no conception of the presence of humans. Blinded by the sun, only one thing could have induced them to leave the dark depths of Submundia. That was the mating instinct. The beetles were evidently rival leaders of some swarm, engaged in a duel to the death. Round and round they went in a dizzy maze, stabbing and thrusting, jaws closing on flesh, until they dropped, close locked in battle, not more than 20 feet from the little party of blacks and whites, both squirming in the agonies of death. "I don't think that necessarily means that the swarm is on our trail," said Tommy, a little later, as the 3 stood beside the shells that they had discarded. "Those 2 were strays, lost from the swarm and maddened by the mating instinct. Still, it might be as well to wear these things for a while, in case they do follow us." "You're right," answered Dodd, as he placed one of the shells around Hydia. "We've got to get this little lady to civilization, and we've got to protect our lives in order to give this great new knowledge to the world. If we are attacked, you must sacrifice your life for me, Tommy, so that I can carry back the news." "Right-ho," answered Tommy with alacrity. "You bet I will, Jim." The glittering sun of mid-afternoon was shining down upon the desert, but Hydia was no longer in pain. It was evident that she was fast becoming accustomed to the sunlight, though she still kept her eyes screwed up tightly, and had to be helped along by Dodd and Jimmy. In high good humor, the three reached the encampment to find that the blacks were feasting on the dead beetles, while the two eldest members of the party had proudly donned the shells. It was near sunset before they finally started. Dodd and Tommy had managed to make it clear to them that they wished to reach civilization, but how near this there was, of course, no means of determining. They noted, however, that the party started in a southerly direction.
"I should say," said Dodd, "that we are in South Australia, probably 300 or 400 miles from the coast. We've got a long journey before us, but these blackfellows will know how to procure food for us."
They certainly knew how to get water, for, just as it began to grow dark, when the three were already tormented by thirst, they stopped at what seemed a mere hollow among the stones and boulders that strewed the face of the desert, and scooped away the sand, leaving a hole which quickly filled with clear, cold water of excellent taste. After which they made signs that they were to camp there for the night. The moon was riding high in the sky. As it grew dark, Hydia opened her eyes, saw the luminary, and uttered an exclamation, this time not of fear, but of wonder.
"Moon," said Dodd. "That's all right, girl. She watches over the night, as the sun does over the day."
"Hydia likes the moon better than the sun," said the girl wistfully, "but the moon not strong enough to keep away the beetles."
"If I was you, I'd forget about the beetles, Hydia," said Dodd. "They won't come out of that hole in the ground. You'll never see them again."
And, as he spoke, they heard a familiar rasping sound far in the distance.
"How the wind blows,"
said Tommy, desperately resolved not to believe his ears.
"I think a storm's coming up."
But Hydia, with a scream of fear, was clinging to Dodd, and the blacks were on their feet, spears and boomerangs in their hands, looking northward. Out of that north, a little black cloud was gathering, a cloud that spread gradually as a thundercloud until it covered a good part of the sky, and still more of the sky, and still more. All the while, that faint, distant rasping was audible, but it did not increase in volume. It was as if the beetles had halted until the full number of the swarm had come up out of the crater. Then the cloud, which by now covered half the sky, began to take geometric form. It grew square. Its ragged edges seemed to trim themselves away. Streaks of light shot through it at right angles, as if it was marshaling itself into companies. The doomed men and the girl stood perfectly still, staring at that phenomenon. They knew that only a miracle could save them. They did not even speak, but Hydia clung more tightly to Dodd's arm. Then suddenly the cloud spread upward and covered the face of the moon.
"Well, this is goodbye, Tommy," said Dodd, gripping his friend's hand. "God, I wish I had a revolver, or a knife."
He looked at Hydia. Suddenly the rasping became a whining shriek. A score of enormous beetles, the advance guards of the army, zoomed out of the darkness into a ray of straggling moonlight. Shrieking, the blacks, who had watched the approaching swarm perfectly immobile, threw away the two shells and bolted.
"Good Lord!" Dodd shouted. "Did you see the color of their shells, Tommy?"
Even in that moment, the scientific observer came uppermost in him.
"Those red edges! They must be young ones, Tommy. It's the new brood. No wonder Brom stayed behind. He was waiting for them to hatch. The new brood. We're doomed! Doomed! All my work wasted!"
The blackfellows did not get very far. 100 yards from the place where they started to run, they dropped, their bodies hidden beneath the illustering monsters, their screams cut short as those frightful beaks sought their throats, and those jaws crunched through flesh and bone. Circling around Dodd, Tommy, and Hydia, as if puzzled by their appearance, the beetles kept up a continuous, furious droning that sounded like the roar of Niagara mixed with the shrieking of 1,000 sirens. The moon was completely hidden, and only a dim, nebulous light showed the repulsive monsters as they flew within a few feet of the heads of the fugitives. The stench was overpowering. But suddenly a ray of white light shot through the darkness, and with a charged note, just perceptible to the ears of the two men, but doubtless of the greatest significance to the beetles, the swarm fled apart to the right and left, clearing a clear line, through which appeared Brom, reclining on his shell couch above his 8 trained beetle steeds. Hovering overhead, the 8 huge monsters dropped lightly to the ground beside the 3. Brom sat up, a vicious grin upon his twisted face. In his hand he held a large electric bulb, its sides sheathed in a roughly carved wooden frame. The wire was attached to a battery behind him. "Well met, my friends," he shouted exultantly. "I owe you more thanks than I can express for having so providentially left the electrical equipment of your plane undamaged after you crashed at the entrance to Submundia. I had a hunch about it, and the hunch worked." He grinned more malevolently as he looked from one man to the other. "You've run your race," he said, "but I'm going to have a little fun with you before you die. I'm going to use you as an object lesson. You'll find out in a little while." Go ahead, Brom." Dodd grinned back at him. "Just a few million years ago, and you were a speck of protoplasm in that pre-Pleistocene age swimming among the invertebrate crustaceans that characterized that epoch." "Invertebrates and monotremes, Dodd," said Brom, almost wistfully. "The mammals were already existence on the Earth, as you know." Suddenly he broke off as he realized that Dodd was spoofing him. A yell of execration broke from his lips. He uttered a high whistle, and instantly the whip-like lashes of 100 beetles whizzed through the darkness and remained poised over Dodd's head. "Not even the marsupial lion, Brom," grinned Dodd, undismayed. "Go ahead, but I'll not die with a lie upon my lips." Chapter 9. The Trail of Death. "There's sure some sort of hoodoo on these Antarctic expeditions, Wilson," said the city editor of the Daily Record to the Star rewrite man. He glanced through the hastily typed report that had come through on the wireless set erected on the 36th story of the record building. "Tommy Trevor's gone, eh? And James Dodd, too. There'll be woe and wailing along the Great White Way tonight when this news gets out. They'll say that half the chorus girls in town consider themselves engaged to Tommy. Nice fella, too. Always did like him. Nice fellow, too. Always did like him. Queer. That curtain of fog that seems to lie on the actual side of the South Pole," he continued, glancing over the reports again. "So Storm thinks that Tommy crashed in it, and that it's 1,000,000 to 1 against their ever finding his remains. What's this about beetles? Shells of enormous prehistoric beetles found by Tommy and Dodd? That'll make good copy, Wilson. Let's play that up. Hand it to Jones and tell him to scare up a catching headline or two." He beckoned the boy, who was hurrying toward his desk, a flimsy in his hand, glanced through it, and tossed it toward Wilson. "What do they think this is, April Fool's Day?" he asked. "I'm surprised that the international press should fall for such stuff as that." "Why, tomorrow is the 1st of April!" exclaimed Wilson, tossing back the Cal Dispatch with a contemptuous laugh. "Well, it won't do the IP much good to play those tricks on their subscribers," said the city editor testily. "I'm surprised, to say the least. I guess their Adelaide correspondent has gone off his head or something. Using poor Travers' name, too. Of course that fellow didn't know he was dead, but still." That was how the Daily Record missed being the first to give out certain information that was to stagger the world. The dispatch, which had evidently outrun an earlier one, was as follows. Adelaide, South Australia, March 31st. Further telegraphic communications arriving almost continuously from Settlers Station. Signed by Thomas Travers, member of Travers' Antarctic Expedition, who claims to have penetrated Earth's interior at South Pole and to have come out near Victoria Desert. Travers states that swarm of prehistoric beetles, estimated at 2 trillion, and as large as men, with shells impenetrable by rifle bullets, now besieging Settlers Station, where he and Dodd and Hydia, woman of subterranean race whom they brought away, are shut up in telegraph office. Brom, former member of Greystoke Expedition, said to be in charge of swarm, with intention of obliterating human race. Every living thing at Settlers Station destroyed, and swarm moving south. It was a small-town paper 100 miles from New York that took a chance on publishing this report from the international press, in spite of frantic efforts on the parts of the head office to recall it after it had been transmitted. The paper published the account as an April Fool's Day joke, though it later took to itself the credit for having believed it. But by the time April Fool's Day dawned, all the world knew that the account was, if anything, an underestimate of the fearful things that were happening down under. It was known now that the swarm of monsters had originated in the Great Victoria Desert, one of the worst stretches of desolation in the world, situated in the southeast corner of Western Australia. Their numbers were incalculable. Wimhush, the aviator, who was attempting to cross the continent from east to west, reported afterward that he had flown for 4 days, skirting the edge of the swarm, and that the whole of the time they were moving in the same direction, a thick cloud that left a trail of dense darkness on Earth beneath them, like the path of an eclipse. Wimbush escaped them only because he had a ceiling of 20,000 feet, to which apparently the beetles could not soar. And this swarm was only about 1/4 of the whole number of the monsters. This was the swarm that was moving westward, and subsequently totally destroyed all living things, in Kalgoorlie, Coolgardie, Perth, and all the coastal cities of Western Australia. Ships were found drifting in the Indian Ocean, totally destitute of crews and passengers. Not even their skeletons were found. And it was estimated that the voracious monsters had carried them away bodily, devoured them in the air, and dropped the remains into the water. All the world knows now how the sea elephant herd on Kerguelen Island was totally destroyed, and of the giant shells that were found lying everywhere on the deserted beaches, in positions that showed the monsters had in the end devoured one another. Mauritius was the most westerly point reached by a fraction of the swarm. A little over 20,000 of the beetles reached that lovely island by count of the shells afterward, and all the world knows now of the desperate and successful fight that the inhabitants waged against them. Men and women, boys and girls, blacks and whites, finding that the devils were invulnerable against rifle fire, sallied forth bodily with knives and choppers, and laid down a life for a life. On the second day after their appearance, the main swarm, 1.5 trillion strong, reached the line of the Transcontinental Railway and moved eastward into South Australia, traveling, it was estimated, at the rate of 200 miles an hour. By the next morning, they were in Adelaide, a city of nearly 250,000 people. By nightfall, every living thing in Adelaide and the suburbs had been eaten, except for a few who succeeded in hiding in walled-up cellars or in the surrounding marshes. That night, the swarm was on the borders of New South Wales and Victoria, and moving in 2 divisions toward Melbourne and Sydney. The northern half, it was quickly seen, was flying wild with no particular objective, moving in a solid cohort 200 miles in length and devouring game, stock, and humans indiscriminately. It was the southern division, numbering perhaps 1 trillion, that was under command of Brahm, and aimed at destroying Melbourne as Adelaide had been destroyed. Brahm, with his 8 beetle steeds, was by this time known and execrated throughout the world. He was pictured as Antichrist and the fulfillment of the prophecies of the Rock of Revelations. And all this while, or rather until the telegraph wires were cut, broken, as it was discovered later, by perching beetles, Thomas Travers was sending out messages from his post at Settler's Station. Soon it was known that prodigious creatures were following in the wake of the devastating horde. Mantises, 15 feet in height, winged things like pterodactyls, longer than bombing airplanes, followed, preying on the stragglers. But the main bodies never halted, and the inroads that the destroyers made on their numbers were insignificant. Before the swarm reached Adelaide, the Commonwealth government had taken action. Troops had been called out, and all the available airplanes in the country had been ordered to assemble at Broken Hill, New South Wales, a strategic point commanding the approaches to Sydney and Melbourne. Something like 400 airplanes were assembled, with several batteries of anti-aircraft guns that had been used in the Great War. Every amateur aviator in Australia was on the spot, with machines ranging from tiny moths to Handley Pages, anything that could fly. Nocturnal though the beetles had been, they no longer feared the light of the sun. In fact, it was ascertained later that they were blind. An opacity had formed over the crystalline lenses of the eye. Blind, they were no less formidable than with their sight. They existed only to devour, and their numbers made them irresistible, no matter which way they turned. As soon as the vanguard of the dark cloud was sighted from Broken Hill, the airplanes went aloft. 400 planes, each armed with machine guns, dashed into the serried hosts, drumming out volleys of lead. In a long line, extending nearly to the limits of the beetle formation, thus giving each aviator all the room he needed, the planes gave battle. The first terror that fell upon the airmen was the discovery that, even at close range, the machine gun bullets failed to penetrate the shells. The force of the impact whirled the beetles around, drove them together in bunches, sent them groping with weaving tentacles through the air. But that was all. On the main body of the invaders, no impression was made whatever. The second terror was the realization that the swarm, driven down here and there from the altitude of several hundred feet, merely resumed their progress upon the ground in a succession of giant leaps. Within a few minutes, instead of presenting an inflexible barrier, the line of airplanes was badly broken, each plane surrounded by swarms of the monsters. Then Brom was seen, and that was the third terror, the sight of the famous beetle steeds, 4 pairs abreast, with Brom reclining like a Roman emperor upon the surface of the shells. It is true, Brom had no inclination to risk his own life in battle. At the first sight of the aviators, he dodged into the thick of the swarm, where no bullet could reach him. Brom managed to transmit an order, and the beetles drew together. Some thought afterward that it was by thought transference that he effected this maneuver, for instantly the beetles, which had hitherto flown in loose order, became a solid wall, 1,000 feet in height, closing in on the planes. The propellers struck them and snapped short, and as the planes went weaving down, the hideous monsters leaped into the cockpits and began their abominable meal. Not a single plane came back. Planes and skeletons, and here and there a shell of a dead beetle, itself completely devoured, were all that was found afterward. The gunners stayed at their post till the last moment, firing round after round of shell and shrapnel, with insignificant results. Their skeletons were found not 20 paces from their guns, where the gunner's monument now stands. Half an hour after the flight had first been sighted, the news was being radioed to Sydney, Melbourne, and all other Australian cities, advising instant flight to sea as the only chance of safety. The radio message was cut short, and men listened and shuddered. After that came the crowding aboard all crafts in the harbors. The tragedies of the Eustis, the All Australia, the Sepphoris, sunk at their moorings. The innumerable sea tragedies. The horde of fugitives that landed in New Zealand. The reign of terror when the mob got out of hand. The burning of Melbourne. The sack of Sydney. And south and eastward, like a resistless flood, the beetle swarm came pouring. Well had Brom boasted that he would make the earth a desert. 100 miles of poisoned carcasses of sheep, extended outside of Sydney's suburbs, gave the first promise of success. Long mounds of beetle shells testified to the results. Moreover, the beetles that fed on the carcasses of their fellows were in turn poisoned and died. But this was only a drop in the bucket. What counted was that the swift advance was slowing down. As if exhausted by their efforts, or else satiated with food, the beetles were doing what the soldiers did. They were digging in. 24 miles from Sydney, 18 outside Melbourne, the advance was stayed. Volunteers who went out from those cities reported that the beetles seemed to be resting in long trenches that they had excavated, so that only their shells appeared above ground. Trees were covered with clinging beetles. Every wall, every house was invisible beneath the beetle armor. Australia had a respite, perhaps only for a night or day, but still time to draw breath, time to consider, time for the shiploads of fugitives to get farther from the continent that had become a shambles. And then the cry went up, not only from Australia, but from all the world. Get Travers! Chapter 10. At Bay. Brom put his fingers to his mouth and whistled, a shrill whistle, yet audible to Dodd, Tommy, and Hydia. Instantly, 3 pairs of beetles appeared out of the throng. Their tentacles went out, and the 2 men and the girl found themselves hoisted separately upon the backs of the pairs. Next moment, they were flying side by side, high in the air above the surrounding swarm. They could see one another, but it was impossible for them to make their voices heard above the rasping of the beetles' legs. Hours went by, while the moon crossed the sky and dipped toward the horizon. Tommy knew that the moon would set about the hour of dawn, and the stars were already beginning to pale when he saw a line of telegraph poles, then 2 lines of shining metals, then a small settlement of stone and brick houses. Tommy was not familiar with the geography of Australia, but he knew this must be the transcontinental line. Whirling onward, the cloud of beetles suddenly swooped downward. For a moment, Tommy could see the frightened occupants of the settlement crowding into the single street. Then he shuddered with sick horror as he saw them obliterated by the swarm. There was no struggle, no attempt at flight or resistance. One moment those 40-odd men were there. The next minute they existed no longer. There was nothing but a swarm of beetles, walking about like men with shells upon their backs. And now Tommy saw evidences of Brom's devilish control of the swarm. For out of the cloud dropped what seemed to be a phalanx of beetle guards, the military police of beetledom, and, lashing fiercely with their tentacles, they drove back all the swarm that sought to join their companions in their ghoulish feast. There was just so much food and no more. The rest must seek theirs further. But even beetles, it may be presumed, are not entirely under discipline at all times. The pair of beetles that bore Tommy suddenly swooped apart, 10 or a dozen feet from the ground, and dashed into the thick of the struggling, frenzied mass, flinging their rider to earth. Tommy struck soft sand, sat up, half-dazed, saw his shell lying a few feet away from him, and retrieved it, just as a couple of the monsters came swooping down at him. He looked about him. Not far away stood Dodd and Hydia, with their shells on their backs. They recognized Tommy and ran toward him. Not more than 20 yards away stood the railroad station, with several crates of goods on the platform. Next to it was a substantial house of stone, with the front door open. Tommy pointed to it, and Dodd understood, and shouted something that was lost in the furious buzz of the beetles' wings as they devoured their prey. The three raced for the entrance, gained it unmolested, and closed the door. There was a key in the door, and it was light enough for them to see a chain, which Dodd pulled into position. There was only one story, and there were 3 rooms, apparently, with the kitchen. Tommy rushed to the kitchen door, locked it to, and, with almost superhuman efforts, dragged the large iron stove against it. He rushed to the window, but it was a mere loophole, not large enough to admit a child. Nevertheless, he stood the heavy table on end so that it covered it. Then he ran back. Dodd had already barricaded the window of the larger room, which was a bed-sitting room, with a heavy wardrobe, and the wooden bedstead, jamming the 2 pieces sidewise against the wall, so that they could not be forced apart without being demolished. He was now busy in the smaller room, which seemed to be the station master's office, dragging an iron safe across the floor. But the window was crisscrossed with iron bars, and it was evident that the safe, which was locked, contained at times considerable money. For the window could hardly have been forced save by a charge of nitroglycerin or dynamite. However, it was against the door that Dodd placed the safe, and he stood back, panting. "Good," said Hydia. "That will hold them." Then the 2 men looked at her doubtfully. Did Hydia know what she was talking about? The sun had risen. A long shaft shot into the room. Outside, the beetles were still buzzing as they turned over the vestiges of their prey. There were as yet no signs of attack. Suddenly, Tommy grasped Dodd's arm. "Look," he shouted, pointing to a corner which had been in gloom a moment before. There was a table there, and on it a telegraphic instrument. Telegraphy had been one of Tommy's hobbies in boyhood. In a moment he was busy at the table. Dot, dash, dot, dash. Then suddenly outside a furious hum and the impact of beetle bodies against the front door. Tommy got up, grinning. That was the first interrupted message from Tommy that was received. Through the barred window, the 3 could see the furious efforts of the beetles to force an entrance. But the very tensile strength of the beetle shells, which rendered them impervious to bullets, required a laminate construction, which rendered them powerless against brick or stone. Desperately, the swarm dashed itself against the walls until the ground outside was piled high with stunned beetles. Not the faintest impression was made on the defenses. "Watch them, Jim," said Tom. "I'll go see if the rear's secure." That thought of his seemed to have been anticipated by the beetles, for as Tommy reached the kitchen, the swarm came dashing against the door and window, always recoiling. Tommy came back, grinning all over his face. "You were right, Hydia," he said. "We've held them all right, and the tables are turned on Brom. Also, I got a message through, I think," he added to Dodd. Dash, dot, from the instrument. Tommy ran to the table again. Dash, dot, went back. For 5 minutes Tommy labored, while the beetles hammered now on one door, now on another, now on the windows. Then Tommy got up. "It was some station down the line," he said. "I've told them, and they're sending a man up here to replace the telegraphist. Also a couple of cops. They think I'm crazy. I told them again. That's the best I could do."
"Dodd, Travers, for the last time, let's talk."
The cloud of beetles seemed to have thinned, for the sun was shining into the room. Brom's voice was perfectly audible, though he himself was invisible. Probably he thought it likely that the defenders had obtained firearms.
"Nothing to say to you, Brom," called Dodd. "We've finished our discussion on the monotremes."
"I want you fellows to stand in with me," came Brom's plaintive tones. "It's so lonesome all by oneself, Dodd."
"Ah, you're beginning to find that out, are you?" Dodd could not resist answering. "You'll be lonelier yet before you're through."
"Dodd, I didn't bring the swarm up here. I swear it. I've been trying to control them from the beginning. I saw what was coming. I believe I can avert this horror. Drive them into the sea or something like that. Don't make me desperate, Dodd. And listen, old man, about those monotremes. Sensible men don't quarrel over things like that. Why can't we agree to differ?"
"Ah, now you're talking, Brom," Dodd answered. "Only you're too late. After what's happened today, we'll have no truck with you. That's final."
"Damn you!" shrieked Brom. "I'll batter down this house.
You'll do nothing, Brom, because you can't," Dodd answered. "Travers has wired full information about your devil horde, and likewise about you, and all Australia will be prepared to give you a warm reception when you arrive."
"I tell you, I'm invincible," Brom screamed. "In 3 days, Australia will be a ruin, a depopulated desert. In a week, all Southern Asia. In 3 weeks, Europe. In 2 months, America."
"You've been taking too many of those pellets, Brom," Dodd answered. Stand back wherever you are, or I'll open the door and throw the slops over you."
Brom's screech rose high above the droning of the wings. In another moment, the interior of the room had grown as black as night. The rattle of the beetle shells against the 4 walls of the house was like the clattering of strange thunder. All through the darkness, Dodd could hear the unhurried clicking of the key. At last, the rattling ceased. The sun shone in again. The ground all around the house was packed with fallen beetles, 6 feet high, a writhing mass that creaked and clattered as it strove to disengage itself. Brom's voice once more. "I'm leaving a guard, Dodd. They'll get you if you try to leave, but they won't eat you. I'm going to have you 3 sliced into little pieces. The 1,000 deaths of the Chinese. The beetles will eat the parts that are sliced away, and you'll live to watch them. I'll be back with a stick or 2 of dynamite tomorrow."
"Yeah, but listen, Brom," Dodd sang out. "Listen, you old marsupial tiger. When those pipe dreams clear away, I'm going to build a gallows of beetle shells reaching to the moon to hang you on."
Brom's screech of madness died away. The strident rasping of the beetle legs began again. For hours the 3 heard it. It was not until nightfall that it died away. Brom had made good his threat, for all around the house, extending as far as they could see, was the host of beetle guards. To venture out, even with their shells about them, was clearly a hazardous undertaking. There was neither food nor water in the place.
"We'll just have to hold out," said Dodd,
breaking one of the long periods of silence. Tommy did not answer. He did not hear him, for he was busy at the key. Suddenly he leaped to his feet.
"God, Jimmy," he cried, "that devil's making good his threat. The swarms in South Australia, destroying every living thing, wiping out whole towns and villages. And they believe me now."
He sank into a chair. For the first time, the strain of the awful past seemed to grip him. Hydia came to his side. "The beetles are Finnish," she said in her soft voice.
"How do you know, Hydia?" demanded Dodd.
"The beetles are Finnish," Hydia repeated quietly, and that was all that Dodd could get out of her. But again the key began to click, and Tommy staggered to the table. Dot, dash, dash, dot. Presently he looked up once more. "The swarm's halfway to Adelaide," he said. "They want to know if I can help them." "Help them!" He burst into hysterical laughter. Toward evening he came back after an hour at the key. "Line must be broken," he said. "I'm getting nothing." In the moonlight, they could see the huge compound eyes of the beetle guards glistening like enormous diamonds outside. They had not been conscious of thirst during the day, but now, with the coming of the cool night, their desire for water became paramount.
"Tommy, there must be water in the station," said Dodd. "I'm going to get a pitcher from the kitchen and risk it." Tommy, take care of Hydia if, he added.
But Hydia laid her hand upon his arm. Do not go, Jimmy Dodd, she said. We can be thirsty tonight, and tomorrow the beetles will be finished.
How do you know?
Asked Dodd again. But now he realized that Hydia had never learned the significance of an interrogation. She only repeated her statement, and again the two men had to remain content. The long night passed. Outside, many facets of the beetle eyes. Inside, the two men, desperate with anxiety, not for themselves, but for the fate of the world, snatching a few moments' sleep from time to time, then looking up to see those glaring eyes from the silent watchers. Then dawn came stealing over the desert, and the two shook themselves free from sleep. And now the eyes were gone. But there was immense activity among the beetles. They were scurrying to and fro, and as they watched, Dodd and Tommy began to see some significance in their movements.
Why, they're digging trenches, Tommy shouted. That's horrible, Jimmy. Are they intending to conduct sapping operations against us, like engineers or what?
Dodd did not reply, and Tommy hardly expected any answer. As the two men, now joined by Hydia, watched, they saw that the beetles were actually digging themselves into the sand. Within the space of an hour, by the time the first shafts of sunlight began to stream into the room, there was to be seen only the massive, rounded shells of the monsters as they squatted in the sand. Now you may fetch water, said Hydia, smiling at her lover. No, you do not need the shells, she added. The beetles are finished. It is as the wise men of my people told me. Wondering, hesitating, Tommy and Dodd unlocked the front door. They stood upon the threshold, ready to bolt back again, but there was no stirring among the beetle hosts. Growing bolder, they advanced a few steps. Then, shamed by Hydia's courage, they followed her, still cautiously, to the station. Dodd shouted as he saw a water tank, and a receptacle above it with a watercock. They let Hydia drink, then followed suit, and for a few moments, as they appeased their thirst, the beetles were forgotten. Then they turned back. There had been no movement in that line of shells that glinted in the morning sunlight. Come, I shall show you, said Hydia confidently, advancing toward the trench. Dodd would have stopped her, but the girl moved forward quickly, eluded him with a graceful, mirthful gesture, and stooped down over the trench. She rose up, raising in her arms an empty beetle shell. Dodd, who had reached the trench before Tommy, turned round and yelled to him excitedly. Tommy ran forward, and then he understood. The shells were empty. The swarm, whose life cycle Brahm had admitted he did not understand, had just molted. It had molted because the bodies, gorged with food, had grown too large for the shells. In time, if left alone, the monsters would grow larger shells, become invincible again. But just now, they were defenseless as newborn babes, and knew it. Deep underneath the empty shells, they had burrowed into the ground. Everywhere at the bottom of the deep trenches were the naked, bestial creatures, waving helpless tentacles and squirming over one another as they strove to find shelter and security. A sudden madness came over Tommy and Dodd.
Dynamite! There must be dynamite!
Dodd shouted as he ran back to the station.
Something better than dynamite,
shouted Tommy, holding up one of a score of drums of petrol. Chapter 11. The World Set Free. They waited 2 days at Settler's Station. To push along the line into the desert would have been useless, and both men were convinced that an airplane would arrive for them. But it was not until the second afternoon that the aviator arrived, half dead with thirst and fatigue, and almost incoherent. His was the last plane on the Australian continent. He brought the news of the destruction of Adelaide and of the siege of Melbourne and Sydney, as he termed it. He told Dodd and Tommy that the two cities had been surrounded with trenches and barbed wire. Machine guns and artillery were bombarding the trenches in which the beetles had taken shelter.
Has anyone been out on reconnaissance? Asked Tommy.
Nobody had been permitted to pass through the barbed wire, though there had been volunteers. It meant certain death. But unless the beetles were sapping deep in the ground, what their purpose was, nobody knew. Tommy and Dodd led him to the piles of smoking, stinking debris and told him. That was where the aviator fainted from sheer relief.
The Commonwealth wants you to take supreme command against the Beatles, he told Tommy when he had recovered. I'm to bring you back. Not that they expect me back, but God, what a piece of news. Forgive me, my swearing. I used to be a parson. Still am, for the matter of that. How are you going to bring us three back in your plane? Asked Tommy. I shall stay here with Jimmy Dodd, said Hydia suavely. There is not the least danger any more. You must destroy the Beatles before their shells have grown again. That's all. Used to be a parson, you say? Still are? Shouted Dodd excitedly. Thank God! I'm glad to hear it. Come inside and come quick. I want you too, Tommy. Then Tommy understood, and it seemed as if Hydia understood, by some instinct that belongs exclusively to women, for her cheeks were flushed, and she turned and smiled into Dodd's eyes. 10 minutes later, Tommy hopped into the biplane, leaving the happy, married couple at Settler's Station. His eyes grew misty as the plane took the air, and he saw them waving to him from the ground. Dodd and Hydia and he had been through so many adventures and had reached safety. He must not fail. He did not fail. He found himself at Sydney in command of 30,000 men, all enthusiastic for the fight for the human race, soldiers and volunteers ready to fight until they dropped. When the news of the situation was made public, an immense wave of hope ran through the world. National differences were forgotten. Color and creed and race grew more tolerant of one another. A new day had dawned, the day of humanity's true liberation. Tommy's first act was to call out the fire companies and have the Beatles' trenches saturated with petrol from the fire hoses. Then, incendiary bullets, shot from guns from a safe distance, quickly converted them into blazing infernos. But even so, only a tithe of the Beetle army had been destroyed. 200 planes had already been rushed from New Zealand, and their aviators went up and scoured the country far and wide. Everywhere they found trenches, and, where the soil was stony, millions of the beetles clustered helplessly beneath great mounds of discarded shells. An army of black trackers had been brought in planes from all parts of the country, and they searched out the beetle masses everywhere along the course that the invaders had taken. Then, incendiary bombs were dropped from above. Day after day, the beetle massacre went on. By the end of a week, the survivors of the invasion began to take heart again. It was certain that the greater portion of the horde had been destroyed. There was only one thing lacking. No trace of Brahm had been seen since his appearance at the head of his beetle army in front of Broken Hill. And louder and more insistent grew the world clamor that he should be found and put to death in some way more horrible than any yet devised. The ingenuity of 1,000,000 minds worked upon this problem. Newspapers all over the world offered prizes for the most suitable form of death. Ingenious Oriental tortures were rediscovered. The only thing lacking was Brahm. A spy craze ran through Australia. 500 Brahms were found, and all of them were in imminent danger of death before they were able to prove an alias. And, oddly enough, it was Tommy and Dodd who found Brahm. For Dodd had been brought back east, together with his bride, and given an important command in the army of extermination. Dodd had joined Tommy not far from Broken Hill, where a swarm of 100,000 beetles had been found in a little-known valley. The monsters had begun to grow new shells, and the news had excited a fresh wave of apprehension. The airplanes had concentrated for an attack upon them, and Tommy and Dodd were riding together, Tommy at the controls and Dodd observing. Dodd called through the tube to Tommy and indicated a mass that was moving through the scrub, some 50,000 beetles, executing short hops and evidently regaining some vitality. Tommy nodded. He signaled, and the fleet of planes circled around and began to drop their incendiary bombs. Within a few minutes, the beetles were ringed with a wall of fire. Presently, the whole terrain was a blazing furnace. Hours later, when the fires had died away, Tommy and Dodd went down to look at the destruction that had been wrought. The scene was horrible. Great masses of charred flesh and shell were piled up everywhere. "I guess that's been a pretty thorough job," said Tommy. "Let's get back, Jim." "What's that?" cried Dodd, pointing. Then, "My God, Tommy, it's one of our men!" It was a man, but it was not one of their men. That creeping, maimed, half-cinder and half-human thing that was trying to crawl into the hollow of a rock. It was Brahm, and recognition was mutual.
Brom dropping, moaning. He was only the shell of a man, and it was incredible how he had managed to survive that ordeal of fire. The remainder of his life, which only his indomitable will had held in that shattered body, was evidently a matter of minutes, but he looked up at Dodd and laughed.
So, you're here. Damn you, he snarled. And you think you've won. I've another card, another invasion of the world, beside which this is child's play. It's an invasion.
Brom was going, but he pulled himself together with a supreme effort.
Invasion by new species of monotremes, he croaked. Deep down in Earth was saving to prove you the liar you are. Monotremes, egg-laying platypus, big as elephant, existent long before Pleistocene epoch. Make you recant, you lying fool.
Brom died, an outburst of bitter laughter on his lips. Dodd stood silently for a while, then reverently he removed his hat.
He was a madman and a devil, but he had the potentialities of a god, Tommy, he said.
The end.
Oh,
no, Discord.
What is this 1930s vocabulary?